Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to talk about how to face the Colle. Beginning after d4, d5, e3 begins the Colle system. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So at the club level, I would say the best move to face the Colle is just going to be this immediate move, bishop f5. Just get this bishop outside the pawn chain. Now I've got a couple reasons for this. At the club level, it's actually a really big deal anytime you can get your bishop outside the pawn chain. One of the interesting things about the Queen's Gambit is it's very difficult to get this bishop outside the pawn chain in a normal double d-pawn opening. For example, after d4, d5, and they play a move like c4, and we play the Slav like c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3 putting pressure on the center, we cannot develop with a move like bishop f5. Because we'd be almost completely lost after, say, cd5, cd5, queen b3, which puts pressure on b7 and d5. At first glance, this doesn't seem like a bad thing. It seems like, okay, they got pressure on both of these squares, but how do you defend b7? If you try to defend b7 with a move like queen c8, the pawn on d5 simply hangs. If you play queen d7, it walks face first into knight e5. So you end up looking at this going, well, maybe I can just defend b7 mechanically. I can play something like pawn to b6. I defended b7. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is something like e4 comes. And then these light squares, this b5 to e8 diagonal is extremely weak. The bishop is coming to b5. So you play d takes e5, and then we have knight e5, and you can see that we're etching out these squares, c6, d7, bishop b5 is a huge threat. And again, you might think, okay, what's the big deal? I can just defend the diagonal. I can play a6, but there was one other threat. Pause the video, see if you can find it. Queen f7 is mate, and the game is simply over. And it turns out it's very difficult to stop both threats. You have bishop b5 coming or queen f7 coming. One of these two threats is going to come. If you put this on an engine, the engine is just giving decisive advantage white. White is just almost completely winning. And this is all just coming from logical moves after a really basic developing move, after just bringing your bishop to f5. And that's why when you face something like a Colle system with pawn to e3, it's pretty incredible that white has put no pressure on d5 and white hasn't developed a piece, which allows you to just bring your bishop to f5, get your bishop outside the pawn chain. So in this position, white has a very clearly established bad bishop, this bishop on c1, and he has a very clearly established good bishop, this bishop on f1. And at the club level, for whatever reason, the variation that you see the most is you're going to see this variation beginning with bishop to d3. And this isn't at all what you see at the highest levels. And then black simply exchanges here, and then you usually see queen d3. cd3 is also possible. e6 is just supposed to be equal. It's a chess game. Again, you've gotten rid of your bad bishop for his good bishop, so it's a good thing. He's planning on striking in the middle, so it makes the game a little bit more dynamic, but it's just equality. So queen d3 is the normal move that you see at the club level. We're going to have c6, we're going to have knight f3, we're going to have e6, c4, knight d7. So we're actually following a game here. We're following Ehlers versus Schwelden, played back in 1996, that continued castles kingside, bishop d6, queen b3, queen c7, knight c3, knight on g to f6, cd5, ed5, and bishop d2. Now at this point, it becomes really obvious this bishop is a bad bishop. And positionally, this is much better for black. Now, on a structural level, white's actually doing okay. Like, white has two center pawns to black's one, and at some point, white, in theory, could begin a minority attack with b4, b5, and if he pulls all that off, he should have an advantage. But the fact is that black is simply better here because he has better pieces. He doesn't have a bad bishop, and, of course, white lost his best piece. White lost his good light-squared bishop, which means white permanently has weaknesses in the light squares as well. So here, black just played knight e4, we have h3, we have knight to f6, we have takes, and then white decides to get rid of his worst piece with bishop to b4, getting rid of his bad bishop. But then black makes a really good decision here. He castles queenside and says, go ahead and get rid of your bad bishop, but I'm going to accelerate my attack on your kingside. I'm going to rook lift and bring my rooks over and just attack your kingside. So after queen to a4, black basically gambled everything, saying, hey, my kingside attack is way faster than your queenside attack. I'm just going to play a6 and just make sure that you can't get through over here on the queenside. What's interesting is probably king b8 was just a little bit better, just not creating the weaknesses, but in the end, it didn't apparently matter very much. Like, a6 is just as good. The kingside attack is coming, and there's just not going to be any real ways to stop it. So we have queen c2, g5, just kind of going all out. He just kind of begins with his pawn storm, going after this kingside. Eventually, this culminates into rook f6, where white has to give up some material. He has to play queen e5, and then black won this extra pawn. Black ended up creating a protected passed pawn on the c4 square, And eventually all this simplifies to where a bunch of pieces come off the board and black is left with this protected passed pawn on the c4 square, which is going to inevitably become a queen. And white just decided to resign right here on move 39 before he made his 40th move, as Ehlers versus Schwelden played back in 1996. So that's sort of the most common variation that you're going to see at the lowest levels. Now, at the highest levels, people don't typically play the bishop f5 move order, which is kind of interesting. At the absolute highest levels, people prefer this knight f6 move order. So I guess the reason that they prefer the knight f6 move order over the bishop f5 move order is because they're not worried about the move bishop d3. Because if bishop d3, they intend to play something like, say, c5. And this actually turns into sort of a favorable stonewall setup. Actually, if you watch my video about crushing the stonewall, we have a stem game here that sort of comes directly from that video. It's Sotsky versus Kamsky played in Novi Sad back in 2016. It continued c3, knight to c6, pawn to f4, but then the bishop gets outside the pawn chain. Bishop to g4, knight f3, e6. And this video is this position is basically ported almost exactly from that video. We get the bishop outside the pawn chain, and here black just does have an advantage. Eventually, black is going to be able to trade off his bad bishop for white's good bishop, and this is going to be a very favorable stonewall structure for black because white's bishop is going to be permanently trapped behind his own pawns, and there's just not going to be any fixing that. So there's the structural issue. So knight f6, bishop d3 is not something that people are concerned about. So the only other move order trick, so to speak, that white could throw at you is you could play something like pawn to c4. And in this case, we could play a move like pawn to e6. And again, nobody's worried about pawn to f4, c5, advantage black. I covered this in another video. So e6, we could have something like, say, knight f3, and then we could have knight on b to d7, and then we could have knight c3, pawn to c6 would transpose directly into the Moran variation. So if you have the Moran variation or the Slav in your repertoire, you're not too worried about transposing directly into it. A lot of these grandmasters do. They have the Moran variation in their repertoire. This is why the knight f6 move order is popular. So you can transpose directly into that. If you don't have it in your repertoire, you can play this independent line. You can actually play this move pawn to a6, which is very similar to a Henenberger variation. We have this interesting game played between Khalifman and Ivanchuk back in Moscow back in 1993 that continued sort of down the normal type of Henenberger plan type thing. They continued a4, and then we had bishop e7, bishop d3, castles, takes on c4, takes c5. Eventually black isolates the pawn, brings the knight to b6, brings the bishop to c6, and this should be approximately equal. And that game actually ended in a draw. That was Khalifman versus Ivanchuk, played in Moscow back in 1993. So this is another interesting way to go if you don't want to go in to the mainline Moran, or if the mainline Moran isn't in your repertoire. So going back, like I said, the strong players, they play knight f6. But again, for these lower rated players, I still recommend bishop f5. Because really the only difference between the knight f6 line and the bishop f5 line is really minute. The only main difference is if they start going down the main line. Like, let's say they play a move like, for example, let's go back and let's say that we play knight f6, knight to f3, and then we have bishop f5. So we go through this. And then we have c4, c6. The only real difference is after knight to c3, we don't have to play e6 if we've inserted the moves knight f6 and knight to f3. If we play bishop f5 first, we kind of do have to play e6 because we don't have the option in that case to play this other option, which is a6. So here we have this game Firouzja versus Carlsen, where Carlsen plays the move a6. a6 is possible here. This actually, Carlsen went on to win with this move pawn to a6, although it's not clear that he was ever actually significantly better in the opening. Probably the opening was still very slight edge white. But it gives black this additional option to play this move pawn to a6 within the main line. Whereas if you were to play this other move order, beginning with this move bishop f5, and then they continue with, say, pawn to c4, and then we play pawn to c6, and then we have knight to c3. We do not have pawn to a6 here, because again, queen b3 comes with some serious force. Queen b3, b5, and then it's just a free pawn. We can't do this. So we need that extra tempo. We need that extra knight f6, knight f3 in. So that's kind of the reason for it. But it's also kind of a silly reason, because what's the big deal? I just play e6, and then we transpose essentially back into the main line. You know, knight f3, knight f6, and we're going to be right back in mainline theory. So if you don't want to play a6 anyway. And if that's not in your repertoire, what's kind of the point of doing the knight f6 move order? It avoids, if you play bishop f5, they can play bishop d3, so knight f6 does avoid bishop to d3, but I don't know if we should even avoid that. Probably just bishop f5, bishop d3 is already equality. So, but anyway, so let's just go over what the absolute main lines are today, which is just knight f6, knight f3, bishop f5. But again, as established, like we can get to this from the bishop f5 move order. Probably doesn't make a big deal. We're going to end up in the same panacea that we're going to have to play against no matter what, which is going to be c4, c6, knight c3, and then pawn to e6. And we're transposing into all of these big, heavy theory games. We're transposing into the Kramnik-Topalov World Championship match games that were played back in 2006. And all of these games kind of revived the Colle system for white. Everybody that plays the Colle system on the highest levels is following sort of what Topalov was doing in these games with the white pieces, where he was continuing with this move knight to h4. And this was the idea. Knight h4, bishop to g6, and then either like knight takes g6 here or g3. There's a couple different moves here. But we'll just make it simple. We'll say knight g6, hg6. So the main line from that match was this move pawn to g3, and then we have knight d7, and then Topalov introduced this move pawn to a3. And we have one really interesting stem game from this match where Topalov basically just trounced Kramnik. Kramnik had the black pieces. And Topalov proved that he was able to get a really big center, and that it was actually very difficult to play against this. The game continued bishop e7, pawn to f4, and then Kramnik decided to break out. He played d capture c4, although it's not 100% clear that this was necessary. Other moves deserve attention for sure, like a5 was certainly possible. Even c5 was possible, just fighting back in the middle of the board. Both of these moves were kind of interesting and would have been potentially okay. But he played dc4, which wasn't as bad as it turned out in the game. He played dc4, bishop c4, and then we have castles, e4, b5, and then b4. And all this was apparently okay right up until here when he played the lemon. He played queen b6 and ended up getting crushed kind of in the middle of the board. He should have played c5. This was his last opportunity. After c5, he would have been okay. Like c5, e5, knight d5, and then say bishop d2. We have bishop c3, bc3 takes. Takes, queen b6 now, bishop a5, queen e6, and then everything would have developed just fine, and he would have had plenty of compensation. Queen h6 just would have been unclear, but probably really just equal. Like black is doing okay here. But like I said, in the game, this was not the route he went down, so if we go into the Wayback Machine here, he, instead of playing c5, decided to play this move queen to b6, and he ended up getting into a lot of trouble just after castles. He never was able to fix the center of the board. He lost the center, which is something we just teach beginners. Just don't lose the center, and you can see here he's just kind of lost the whole center, and he ended up getting crushed. But it doesn't mean that what he did was necessarily bad. I mean, he obviously ended up getting crushed in this particular game. But it also gave players sort of an idea about maybe different paths that we should go down within this line. So one of the big improvements that came from looking at these Topalov versus Kramnik games was, hey, what about this move bishop to e4? And this goes into sort of the last sort of stem game that I want to show today, which is the game between Nakamura and Karyana. And this was really interesting. So bishop e4 just gets played just to kind of induce like one more move. We want white to play f3. Why do we want white to play f3? I don't know. Just pawn moves in general are bad, so we want them to make one more pawn move before we do anything. So we have bishop to g6, queen b3, queen c7, and then we have knight g6, hg6, bishop d2. So now Karyana doesn't even try to play bishop b4. He doesn't go for broke or anything like that, trying to get rid of this dark squared bishop. But he also doesn't really have any intention of relieving the tension in the middle with dc4. He just plays just like a normal move. He just plays bishop e7. And then we have c takes d5, and then c takes d5, castles queenside, knight c6, king b1, a6, rook c1, knight d7, bishop d3, rook c8, knight e2, pawn to b5, pawn to e4, and then knight to b6. What I find interesting about this game is how Karyana makes it look like so easy. Like, you would think like black should be a little bit worse here. You know, white has the bishop pair, black has less space, but apparently black is just doing pretty good, you know, already. We have this e takes d5, e takes d5, knight to f4, and then we have queen d6 holding that pawn, and then we have knight to c4. So the knight's going to be plopping down into that square. We have threats, we have knight d2, etc. We have bishop to f4, then simply queen d7, pawn to g4, g5, bishop to f5. And again, this looks bad. Like you would think we're in trouble, right? No, we're not. Just queen to d8, and he makes a defensive move. He has to play bishop to e3. And you might be wondering, like, why can't we just take the rook? Like, if we take the rook, then we can take here, and there's this additional threat. Knight d2 check is also a threat, forking king and queen. So it's not so simple to fix all these problems. So bishop to e3, rook c7, king a1, pawn to g6 hitting that bishop, bishop back to b1, queen d6, bishop to f2, rook c8, bishop g3, queen back to d7, here, a5, a4, bishop to, there, bishop f6, and then we have bishop takes d4, and this is cute. Rook c e1 check, king d8, and apparently this is pretty much it. We're threatening everything. We're threatening to take, but we're also just threatening bishop takes b2 mate. And White didn't have a good move here. He had to sacrifice his queen, so Nakamura played queen takes d4, knight takes d4, knight h8, knight b3 check, takes, so the threat is queen a7 check, which wins. So we have check, preventing that threat. So king c7. Now the threat is rook a8 check, which would win. Bishop f5, forking the queen and rook. Knight d2. You can have my queen. Again, the threat is if bishop takes queen, we have rook a8, which is mate. Rook c1 check, king b6. Now we're threatening both. We're threatening queen a7 and rook a8, which would both be mate. So then we have bishop back check, and then d4. Our queen is hanging. But guess what? Both threats are back on the table. Queen a7 and rook a8 are still on the table. And bishop d4 check, queen d4 does not help because, yeah, you can take the rook with anything. But then queen a4 check is still on the table, which is completely winning. So Nakamura finally gave up the ghost here, and he resigned with the white pieces. That was Nakamura versus Caruana, played back in St. Louis back in 2016, which, if I remember correctly, was an absolutely amazing tournament for Caruana. Caruana was on fire in that tournament. But that's kind of like the modern approach to all this, is after they play knight h5, you can throw in bishop e4, bring the bishop back to g6, and then you kind of just plan on maintaining your center. People are a little bit more reluctant to give up the center after, Kramnik kind of had that bad experience with it where he played d takes c4. And for the most part, these positions are considered pretty close to equality. You're just supposed to be able to play chess from both sides here, and everything's supposed to be fine. And this is kind of just how we approach playing against the modern Colle. So this position right here kind of starts the modern day panacea of the opening, or panacea of the opening, and this is where you should probably begin sort of your study on what you're going to be looking at. Now you're going to be playing with the black pieces. Well, anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. Hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.